On Friday night, we had an attempted military coup of the government in Turkey. This is huge news. I mean, this is gigantic because Turkey, of course, is in NATO. It's one of the most democratic and secular countries in the Muslim world. It has a history, actually, of secularism, and it was kind of the go-to example of, well, see, democracy could work in the Muslim world. Look at Turkey. You know, Turkey was the Western ally, somewhat success story for a very, very long time. But recently, this secular streak and this secular history has been chipped away at. So the coup ended up failing. Now, the president, of course, is Tayyip Erdogan. We've spoken about him before on multiple different occasions. He was on a plane when they stormed the palace. So members of the military stormed the palace. There was gunfire at the palace, at the presidential palace. There were also various government buildings that were bombed as well. So this was serious. And in the streets, you had firefights between factions of the military who were doing the coup. And it wasn't like, you know, a minuscule percentage of them or like the tiniest minority of them. It was a decent number of people in the military who were doing it. Now, not all aspects of the military were behind it. So I think the Navy was not in on it, and aspects of the Air Force were not in on it, but others were. And you had fights between the military and the police in the street. The police being loyal to Tayyip Erdogan, the president, and the military trying to overthrow Erdogan. So at the end of the night, it was a disaster because 290 people, at least 290 people were killed. Initially, there were reports of minimum 42 people being killed, but last night when I was doing the research for the show, I came across the number from CNN, 290 people, at least 290 people were killed. That's people on both sides of this, people in the military, people on the side of Erdogan, and the police, I guess you can say. But now, I mean, it was already a nightmare, just so far in the story. But the nightmare really, really begins after the failed attempt, because CNN reports thousands of soldiers have been arrested and hundreds of judiciary members removed since Friday's uprising. Around 6,000 people have been detained and arrests will continue, according to Turkey's foreign ministry. So according to Zero Hedge, Erdogan has already purged 2,745 judges and prosecutors. Oh no. So again, for those of you who haven't been following Turkey very closely, or you don't recall the various Secular Talk segments that we've done on Erdogan, Erdogan is deeply authoritarian, he's deeply theocratic, and there are stories of him, for example, getting people locked up because they dared make fun of him on social media. One person compared him to Gollum from Lord of the Rings. That person is now locked up. There's a story of a wife who turned the channel every time Erdogan came on in their home. The husband loves Erdogan, snitched on the wife. The wife they arrested, and they were, trying to crack down on her. He's a bad dude. He's a bad dude. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should overthrow him in a military coup, but the bottom line is, now that the military coup failed, you can bet your bottom dollar that he's going to become more authoritarian and more theocratic. So he was already trying to entrench powers with himself as a unitary executive leader. Right now in Turkey, it's not supposed to be that the president has the power. It's not a system like the United States. It's supposed to be that the prime minister has the power. So when Erdogan was prime minister, because he was, all of a sudden he had all the power. Because that's what he's supposed to be. Right, prime minister has power. Prime minister has power. So, but when he left there and he became president, president's supposed to be a symbolic role in Turkey. All of a sudden, no, look at that. Now the president has all the power. He's trying to give himself all the power. He tried to make constitutional changes recently to legitimately just give him all the power. And it failed. It failed. But then there was this coup attempt. And then now I guarantee you he's going to use this to say, well, I mean, look, if you're against me having all the power now, I guess you're a traitor to your country and I can purge you and I can lock you up and you can be a political prisoner. Dude, over 6,000 people already arrested. And by the way, like, don't get it twisted. This idea that, like, no, Erdogan really knows who was behind the coup. No, he doesn't. He's just taking every single person who he ever had a beef with, who he wanted to purge, and he's purging them. And he's using the attempted coup as an excuse to purge them. So when the coup failed, Erdogan gave a press conference, and he said this. Oh, I saw this live, and it gave me chills. He said, "The uprising is a gift from God to us because it will help us clean the military." We're in trouble. According to CNN, quote, Erdogan also said he did not rule out bringing back the death penalty for the coup's perpetrators. As a crowd chanted, "We want the death penalty," he said, and I quote, "We can't ignore the people's request in a democracy. This is your right." Oh, this is getting worse and worse. So the story also gets weirder because every major political party in Turkey, including the HDP, was opposed to the coup. So that made a lot of people go, And it also got widespread praise, to be clear, because, you know, people are making the argument, well, it's good if your country gets past the point where a coup is like, well, this is the preferred course of action, and will keep stability. Obviously, people would rather have elections, and the system's obviously more pure, and the process works better if you just go through elections and stuff. But every single major political party was like, well, we denounce this, and basically, you know, we're not behind this. So it's still not entirely clear who even did the coup. And this is where, you know, I have been disheartened by looking on social media and seeing people come out hard in favor for it or against it and, like, just kind of only giving one side of it, because there's a chance that the coup was staged by what people are calling Gulenists. So there's this religious leader who Erdogan used to be close with that had a falling out a while back. This religious leader is now exiled in the United States. He lives in Pennsylvania. He set up a bunch of charter schools, some Islamic schools. And if indeed the coup was staged by Gulenists, and by the way, Erdogan is totally convinced that it's from Gulenists because he's yelling at the U.S. you have to deport him. If you're a good ally, you'll bring him back to us. Give him back to us to face justice. So he's convinced of it. I'm not really totally convinced of it. But if indeed it was Gulenists who tried to overthrow him, then if you're a secularist or a liberal and you want to support that coup, that really doesn't make sense because Gulenists are arguably right of Erdogan. How's that even possible? I know, right? How is that possible? Erdogan's fucking a crazy theocratic maniac. He's been funding Islamists and jihadists in Syria because he wants to topple Assad that badly. So, but how is it possible? Well, I don't know. From everything I've read about Gulen so far, it appears like he would perhaps be even more authoritarian than Erdogan. He would perhaps be more theocratic than Erdogan. Perhaps it's not something that you should support if indeed it was these Gulenists who were trying to overthrow it. Now, but it's also possible that it was secularists who tried to overthrow him. Basically, liberal secularists and small d Democrats who fear that Turkey has already gone fully authoritarian, which there is an argument to make in that direction, and they wanted to oust him and basically have new elections. Because you have to understand, and I didn't know this until, reading about it after the coup attempt, but apparently in Turkey, it's not, like, this has happened a few other times before. I think once in the 1980s and once in the 1960s or something like that. And the idea in Turkey, the way the system's set up, the president is not the commander-in-chief. And historically, in Turkey's history, people have had more loyalty to the military than they do to any given government. And it's written in the Turkish constitution that the military is supposed to uphold secularism and democracy. So if they see a threat to Turkey's secular history and democratic history, well, then, I guess the argument has been in the past that it indeed is actually more democratic to do the coup, have this brief interim period, and then you just have new elections. So if it's the case that, that was the direction they were going in, well, then it's like, I'm not necessarily for the coup in that respect, but then I get it more. There's a better argument for it than if it's even further right-wing Gulenists. But look, at this point, I really don't know where I fall overall because I still don't know if it was Gulenists or if it was secularists. And I think that matters. But then also, I don't know if it really is the case that, for example, if Erdogan had lost the next election, that he still would have found a way to do a power grab and stay in power. You know what I mean? So in other words, maybe it was still possible for him to lose via elections. Now, there were credible stories of election fuckery from AKP, which is Erdogan's party behind the scenes, in one of the recent elections. But I don't know. He won one of the elections with like 50-some-odd%, which is not the hallmark of somebody who really did steal an election. Usually when somebody steals an election, 98%, 90%. Like, this is what you see historically when somebody becomes a full out-and-out dictator, because they want to fake overwhelming support, so they make people feel in the country like if they disagree with the leader, well, you're the only one. So nobody speaks up against him. So it's this weird trick that authoritarian leaders do. So it's a messy situation, because you could say, hey, Erdogan's authoritarian, Erdogan's theocratic, for the sake of Turkey, you got to overthrow him and it's got to succeed. You can make that argument. But then on the flip side, you could also make the argument, well, it depends who's doing the coup, and it's also the case, keep it real, that you're saying this authoritarianism is so wrong and so bad that I will out-authoritarian the authoritarian, and therefore I'm better? Well, no, you just did authoritarianism to fight authoritarianism. I don't know. That's a little bit of a contradiction there. So, look, again, I don't know where I fall because I don't even know who necessarily did it. The articles are not clear on that. Erdogan's convinced it's Gulenist. I've heard from people on Twitter who know the situation even better than I do, whether they're Turkish, they're on the ground, what have you. And they're like, no, this was a real attempt at to overthrow him and have a real secular democracy again. So I don't know. I genuinely don't know. You guys know I like to come out here and have strong opinions on shit, but I'm telling you, I really don't know the reality to it. All right, so from here on out, it is going to be a messy, dangerous, scary time in Turkey. I mean, it's already been scary for a while because Erdogan's a mess. He is authoritarian. He is a strong man. He is theocratic. Like I said, he's been in bed with the wrong people in Syria, Islamists and jihadists. You have Turkey recently was attacked by ISIS, but then also there are instances where they get attacked by the PKK. So, they're between a rock and a hard place, man. To me, it looks like now, because of how everything unfolded, there is no winning. There is no winning. Either you get Erdogan and he gets more authoritarian and more theocratic, that would be a disaster. Turkey just straight drove off a cliff. Or, let's say the coup had succeeded, well, you just had a military coup, and who knows what happens in the wake of a military coup, especially in this political climate that we have right now and the destruction and the craziness happening all around the world. It was a real possibility that if you overthrew Erdogan, you end up getting somebody worse, in which case, by definition, that is worse. So, it's like there's no good options. And Turkey is a super important country, the second biggest army in NATO. The U.S. has bases there strategically to do for stuff in Iraq and I think Syria. And there's also, interesting conspiracy theories going on now too about, well, maybe Erdogan staged it against himself so that he couldn't, take all the power and really become a unitary executive, go full authoritarian, so he staged it against himself. I don't know if I believe that. I really don't. And then also there's the other Alex Jonesy theory that I was riffing on the other night, which is the same day that this happened, John Kerry and Vladimir Putin had a meeting in Russia, and they were talking about Syria. Now, for those of you who don't know, there's huge differences between the U.S. and Russia on Syria, but they're talking it out. So Russia obviously backs the Assad government. That's their ally. And they're fighting the rebels, who at this point are mainly Islamists and jihadists. I mean, I'm sure there's some moderate rebels left, but the overwhelming majority at this point are just bad people. Jihadists, Islamists, Al-Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda, ISIS. So it may have been the case that the U.S. finally came around and said, you know what, as bad as Assad is, and as much as he's not our ally, he's Russia's ally, and he's Iran's ally, as terrible as he is, as much as we've spoken out against him, he's the only thing standing between Syria staying Syria or becoming Al-Qaeda-stan. So, okay, Russia, you got it. Let's make a deal and let's work together to try to defeat the Islamists and jihadist rebels. Now, there is no reports that that was the conclusion they reached and that they have a deal on that. But it's interesting that they're having peace talks about this and trying to come to some sort of reasonable agreement on Syria. And then Erdogan gets overthrown. Now, why is that interesting? Because Erdogan is not entertaining the conversation of, hey, maybe Assad should stay in there, or there should be an interim government, or, you should transition to a more, Sunni Shia mixed government. Like, he is incredibly anti-Assad, so if he stays in power and Russia and the U.S. had agreed to keep Assad there, well, then there's no telling what Erdogan would do, because he's a loose cannon. He might go balls to the wall and not only arm the Islamists and jihadists as he's been doing in Syria, he might send the fucking Turkish army in there. Well, now we know that they're not really on his side, some aspects of the military. But the problem is you can't have an agreement between NATO and Russia on Syria and try to get peace when the second biggest army in NATO and a major country in the region is against your deal. So the idea may have been, hey, if we get rid of him and we put Gulen in power, maybe Gulen will roll with this. So I don't know. Again, I'm just talking shit here, and I'm just giving my Alex Jonesy theory. But either way, it's a weird situation. It's a scary situation. And man, do I feel for everybody in Turkey and what they're going through right now. If you're in Turkey and you're a liberal, you're a secularist, you've already experienced quite a bit of oppression. It's going to get a hell of a lot worse, and my heart is with you, and I don't know how there's a way to remedy this situation in a way that works in the long run. I really don't. So just be safe there. Just be safe.